here, and today I kind of want to come and have a conversation with my non-affirming traditionalist brothers and sisters. What I mean by that are those of you who do not believe that the Bible permits LGBT people to be included in the full life of the church and to be in open, monogamous, same-sex relationships. Those who have scriptural, biblical, theological convictions that say that you cannot affirm people who are living openly LGBT lives. The first thing I want to say to you is, as somebody who identifies as both an evangelical and a queer person, I don't believe you're the enemy. I know that there are many in the broader community that seem to just want to demonize and attack anybody who holds a position that isn't for full openness and acceptance of LGBT people. And while I understand that a lot of those arguments are based in beliefs and logic that I would agree with, I still don't believe that it's right to say that everyone's homophobic and that everyone's bigoted and that everyone hates gay people. I know that there are so many of you who would switch overnight if you could be convinced biblically and theologically that same-sex relationships weren't sinful. You would become the greatest advocates tomorrow if you could. I know that there are so many of you who really struggle with loving people in your lives and in your community that are LGBT and your conviction of what the Bible teaches. I don't think you're the enemy. I understand your struggle. I've been there. But what I do want to talk about today, just briefly, is when good intentions, which is what so many of you have, meet actual harmful teaching, practice, and theology. We need to realize that our words, our writing, what we talk about actually has consequences. Words are not just these kind of ethereal things that exist somewhere out here. Words have power. Words shape people's lives and destroy people's lives. The scriptures say that life and death is in the power of the tongue. What we write, what we say, how we act actually influences the real lives of real LGBT Christians and LGBT people in general. And so often those with good intentions who really are desiring to be more compassionate and more caring and more accepting of LGBT people are actually doing a great deal of harm. And I kind of want to address that today and show you what I mean. I have this friend named Preston Sprinkle who I've met with once. We've had a good conversation and I've been in correspondence with. And he came out with 2 books called Living in a Gray World, A Christian Teen's Guide to Understanding Homosexuality, and A People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. On the other hand, I have another new friends who have come up with a book called Space at the Table, Brad Harper and Drew Stafford Harper. These 2 different sets of books represent 2 ways of engaging in the LGBT conversation. Preston is a traditionalist Christian theologian. And while he really has tried to be compassionate, the subtitle of this book, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue, is meant to say that homosexuals are real people. We're talking about people, not just a theological concept. And so right off the bat, you can tell he's coming at this with a good intention, or at least it appears that his desire is not to just condemn homosexuality and condemn homosexuals. He wants to change the notion that Christians are anti-gay and show a more loving way. And yet when you read the stories and examples in both of these books and the theology in Preston's books, what we find is that the words in these books are incredibly destructive. The message is harmful. If an LGBT teenager were to pick up this book, there is a good chance that they would walk away with a great deal of self-hatred and a great deal of self-loathing and a great deal of questioning whether or not they could be a Christian, whether or not God could ever love them, based on what Preston writes in this book. And I'm going to see if I can find a couple examples just to give you an idea of why I think this person with good intentions has written something that's incredibly destructive. On page 19, Preston starts off talking about some real stories of real people who are LGBT. And at the end of the page, Preston writes, and then there's Maddie. Maddie is a lesbian, but she's not attracted to women. This seems weird until you hear her story. When Maddie was 9 years old, her dad chained her to a toilet in the basement and fed her scraps of food for 3 months. He then apologized and released her, and warned her that he'd kill her if she told anyone about what had happened. As if this wasn't bad enough, he raped her over the next 4 years. And that's why Maddie is a lesbian. She isn't attracted to women, but she chooses to be a lesbian because she vows that because of what her father did to her, no man will ever touch her again. When you hear a story like that, when you are writing a book, first of all, for teenagers, and it's a theological case that's supposed to help young people who are living in the secular culture where LGBT people are surrounding them, in media and in schools, and you put forth this example, two things happen, I want to say. First, people will call BS on this. This is a book about homosexuality. This isn't a book about sexual abuse. This isn't a book about rape. This is a book about LGBT people, people who have who are sexual and gender minorities. Most of us, the vast majority of us, would say that our sexuality is something that's been with us since birth, that our gender identity is something that's been a part of us since birth. That this isn't something we choose, and most psychotherapists, most scientists, most biologists, the growing consensus is that sexuality is never chosen, gender identity is never chosen, it's a part of our makeup as human beings. And yet Preston, in the very beginning of this book, starts off with a story of a girl who is supposedly a lesbian, who's not attracted to women, which by definition makes her not a lesbian. And the reason she's claiming the lesbian identity is because she was chained to a toilet, and raped by her father. Now, I believe Maddie's a real person. I believe Maddie's story is real, and there is space for Maddie's story. But again, this isn't a book about sexual abuse. This is a book about homosexuality in general. And the vast majority of LGBT people do not resonate with that story, would say that that story is so far from the truth, and the truth claims embedded in that story are so unrealistic and so false that it's laughable, or honestly, cryable. Because I know that if an LGBT teen picked up this book, and they are really struggling with their faith and sexuality, and they read Maddie's story, and Preston is setting it forth as kind of the regular story for LGBT people, they're going to start wondering, was it mom or dad that abused me? Was there some sort of dysfunctional family dynamic? You're going to cause such fear, such pain within a person. I mean, and I say this out of my own experience, because growing up when I had questions about my own sexuality, I started asking pastors. And a lot of them kept pointing back to saying, it's actually your family. It's actually your over-attached mother and your distant father. That's why you're feeling this. And it's actually just a psychological condition. It's actually just sinful. If you get some psychological help and go to the cross of Jesus, you can be healed. And that is ultimately what the message of this book becomes. Not only that, but Preston denies in this book for teenagers that people that are openly LGBT can be Christians. And I think that argument is such a ridiculous, outlandish argument that it shouldn't even be on the table anymore. Because anyone who believes in Christian orthodoxy knows that the Bible teaches that anyone who confesses Jesus is Lord can only do so by the power of the Holy Spirit. That everyone who submits to Jesus Christ and bears good fruit is truly a Christian. And I can tell you my own life and the lives of hundreds of thousands of other LGBT Christians around the world, our lives bear good fruit, and we confess Christ as Lord, and we do it by the power of the Holy Spirit. This is not a salvation issue. And yet Preston writes on page 130, the real question comes when someone is engaging in the sin of homosexual sex and believes that such an act is perfectly fine, and yet continues to confess Christ. The Bible considers this to be sexual immorality, and there's a good chance that those who persist in sexual immorality are not genuinely saved. But at the end of the day, God only knows. Maybe they are genuinely saved and only backsliding. Or maybe they aren't truly saved. It's hard for us humans to know. Again, good intentions met with really harmful words. What you've now implanted into the minds of young LGBT people who would read this book is that if they ever choose any other option besides non-affirming theology, they aren't saved. And in Christian lingo, that means they are going to hell when they die. Or at very least, they're backslid. They've walked away from Christ. They've turned their backs on God and his desire for their life. That is harmful theology. Those stories are unrealistic. That theology is simply bad theology. Christian orthodoxy has never said that issues of sexuality are an issue of orthodoxy. You can be a Christian and be LGBT. And even if you have a hard time understanding that theologically, the lives of hundreds of thousands of Christians that are LGBT should be enough evidence that God is doing something in the hearts and in the lives of LGBT people, causing them to confess Christ. In fact, Pew Research released a poll that's going to be, you can see the link in the bottom of this video, recently, that says that while almost every other demographic is declining in American Christianity, LGBT people are coming to faith or returning to Christian faith at a higher rate than almost any other group of people. God is doing something in the hearts and minds of LGBT people. God is drawing LGBT Christians to himself. God is making room in his kingdom for LGBT people. And this book simply denies that reality. It turns a blind eye to the demographic changes, to the experiential changes, and only keeps perpetuating a tired old theology that's been perpetuated in book after book after book for decades. On the other hand, Space at the Table, this book by my friends Brad and Drew Harper, the reason I like this book, even though the father is a conservative Christian who has a non-affirming theology, is because it platforms the voice of an actual LGBT Christian. This is a conversation between a father and a son, the son who is openly LGBT, and the father who is traditionalist and not affirming of LGBT relationships, but loves his son. This book models, in a very real way, the next phase, the phase that the church should be at today, where we are willing to say, our theology might not be able to make room for this right now, but we know our sons and our daughters. We know the people in our community that have confessed Christ, that have had a genuine relationship with God and are openly LGBT. And there is room at the table for their voices and their stories. We might not be able to make heads or tails of it theologically, but we see that God is doing something. And this book, this conversation between this father and son, Christian theologian and openly LGBT person, is beautiful for the fact that it allows both voices to be heard. It allows them to be heard compassionately and lovingly. And at the end of the day, the conclusion is this, that no matter what we believe, there's space at the table. We can disagree, but love requires us to make room for one another. This book acknowledges much of what science and biology and genetics and psychology has taught us about sexuality and gender identity. And the theologian is not afraid to engage with these new realities. And at the same time, it uplifts a voice that says, you know what, I actually believe that the Bible teaches it's okay for me to be openly LGBT. There is space at the table for both voices. These sets of books represent the two sides of this conversation in the non-affirming world. There are those who just want to perpetuate old, tired myths and old, tired theology that has been disproven and that is harmful, that is destructive. And then there are those that are willing to come to the table and put unconditional love, unconditional grace first, and say, my theology might not be able to make heads or tails of this, but there is a real person in front of me. A real person made in the image and likeness of God. And they confess Christ, they love God, and I've got to make room for their voice at the table. This is not, I'm not asking non-affirming people to concede or give up ground. What I am asking is that we simply let go of falsehoods like Maddie's story, making that the narrative of LGBT people. That's simply absurd. And we need to let go of some of these old tired notions that you can't be gay and Christian, or that the gospel is on the line when we talk about marriage and sexuality. These things are simply not true. They've never been true. It's never been part of historic Christian theology, and it doesn't make sense in almost any systematic theology. There is room at the table for disagreement. And that's the kind of heart that we need in this conversation. The reason Preston's books and many other books, I have another friend named Landon Schott who just wrote a book called Gay Awareness, which goes about 10 steps further than Preston went and says that LGBT affirming people are demonic and influenced by Satan. That sort of rhetoric, that sort of theology is simply unacceptable. That is homophobia. That is bigotry. That is leaning into a political moment and using heated rhetorical language so that you can pump up people and rally people against LGBT people. That rhetoric should be condemned. That rhetoric is homophobia. The stories like Preston put forward about Maddie and other people that he talks about in this book, that's not just one random story. That kind of idea runs throughout this entire book and runs throughout this book for adult theology. Those ideas are connected to homophobia, and the reason we say that is because they are so patently untrue for the large majority of LGBT people, and they are being uplifted as the normative situation. And when that happens, that is only to perpetuate a certain kind of fear. It's only meant to perpetuate a certain political ideology. That parents will read that book and come away, if their kid is LGBT, thinking, did somebody abuse our child? Is that why they're gay or lesbian or transgender? Are they broken? Have they been hurt? That is absurd. Numerous studies have come out and shown that LGBT kids that grow up in religious families that have this sort of non-affirming ideology are 5 times on average more likely to commit suicide. Children's lives are on the line. Adults' lives are on the line. Real people's lives are on the line. And we have to cut out this negative, this anti-LGBT, this tired and old and bigoted rhetoric that only serves to harm and perpetuate cultural stereotypes. It doesn't belong in the lips of a Christian. What needs to happen is space needs to be made at the table. Opposing views need to be brought together at the table and both recognized as beloved children of God, as legitimate Christian views, even though we disagree. That's what Brad and Drew Harper model in their book. That's what so many others have modeled. And that's what non-affirming traditionalists need to come to understand. That's how this conversation needs to happen. I know that's a lot to take in, but I really just felt like it's important to address this because I know so many of you feel so cornered by this whole conversation. Make space. Seek love first. Seek grace first. Come with humility, not with dogmatism. That is what we need. I'm Brandan Robertson. Thank you so much for taking time to watch this video. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.